The proposed 2017-18 district budget will be shared with the board at tonight's meeting. The 2017-18 notice of hearing is provided in Appendix 5. It is recommended the board approve the publication of the 2017-18 notice of hearing that will set the annual budget hearing for August 28th, 2017. That is a correction. Thank you.
Welcome back, Susan and Dee.
Thank you. Good evening, President Rohde, Vice President Arnold, Superintendent Thompson, members of the board. May I just say, phew.
And I'll second that.
We were still working on this morning, so we were cutting it pretty close to bring this forward to you today. Certainly, I'd like to hats off to Dee Grunder. My goodness, heavy lifting on this. Herculean effort.
Thank you.
I didn't share this with her earlier, but I also had a nightmare last night. I had the hiccups while I was giving this presentation, so I wanted my backup plan to be very knowledgeable on what's going on in the budget. So I think this budget easily could have been moved up to a good news item. I'm very excited to present this to you tonight. It's maybe not as good news as we have hoped. It may not be enough good news to make up for 9 years of budget adjustments and cuts, but it is certainly a step in the right direction. And so we're very pleased to be able to present this to you tonight. We'd like to start, first of all, though, looking back at the process of the last year. I would use the term, we lived in budget uncertainty almost the entire year. We were constantly hoping for the best, but planning for the worst. So I think it would be beneficial for us to kind of step back through the year, set that stage so that you can see how we've positioned ourselves for fiscal year 18 and moving forward in a very positive light. So I kind of want to start with August 2016, where the board adopted a $662 million budget. We were in year 2 of the block grant, where funding was essentially flat. We were locked in at a flat rate for general state aid and on the LOB. The district had gone through a very painful process of cutting the budget, $22.7 million, in order to balance. There was a late Supreme Court decision concerning equity that did provide some additional capital outlay and some property tax relief on the LOB. There was also a late year notification that our indirect rate went to 0%. That's the rate that we can charge federal funds for overhead items such as payroll and accounts payable, which also had a negative impact on last year's budget that we were able to offset with some of our year-end cash carryover. So that set the stage for us to go into fiscal year 17. In the fall, the news was the state was not making its revenue estimates. Month after month after month, we heard that same bad news, if you will, that the state was struggling and that they weren't raising enough tax dollars based on their plan. So in November, the state lowered its revenue estimates by $350 million. And there became legitimate concern that the state would either miss state aid payments, be late with state aid payments, or that the governor would exercise his allotment authority to reduce funding to schools. And that was the kind of the shadow we were living under in the fall of 2016. As we got into January, when the legislative session began, instead of allotments, the governor had submitted a budget which included some internal borrowings, potentially selling the tobacco settlement, increasing consumption taxes, delaying KPERS payments, none of which was met with any great enthusiasm at the legislative level. So the legislative, maybe that's putting it nicely.
Said that very nicely.
So the legislature had its work cut out, facing that $280 million shortfall. At that point, it had to begin to work on a tax plan, a budget, and a school finance formula. As those discussions started to occur, a shift from allotments to potentially mid-year cuts for school districts kind of was popping up almost every week, and the numbers would fluctuate almost every week. We had threats as low as $5 million. At one time, it was close to $20 million of potential. The cut impact to USD 259. Again, another significant budget uncertainty that we were living with on a week-to-week basis. And to strengthen that fear was the fact that the state failed to make its third KPERS payment on time. We were expecting them to skip the fourth, but the fact that the third payment didn't get made did definitely reinforce that the state was in some fiscal uncertainty itself. And as we moved into the March-April timeframe, in March, the Supreme Court ruled that the block grant was unconstitutional as to adequacy, solidifying the need for the legislature to take some sort of action concerning the block grant. They could not extend the block grant by another year, so something was going to have to happen. As the threat of a mid-year cut diminished, we still did not have a tax plan. We did not have a school funding formula. We didn't have a budget. So we began, if you recall, to have some conversation about hoping for the best, but planning for the worst, in that we didn't know how much new money we would have. We didn't know if we would have any new money. So we were identifying some savings in the budget through utility savings, fuel costs, transportation, other areas that we would typically have budget fallout, that we would basically hold on to some of those reserves in case we needed to use them to cover fixed cost. And I'll have a reminder slide here in just a little bit to remind the board that we were estimating about an $8.2 million fixed cost increase. And so that was kind of the plan through that March-April timeframe. Knowing that the Supreme Court had also made that decision that the block grant was not constitutional, the threat of school closure, we really started to talk about that in March and April, because that's when we had the decision, so we knew that that threat had become a lot more real. And in April, the state missed its fourth KPERS payment, so we definitely knew we were on track. May, June, the concerns in May, especially early May, the concerns of a possible shutdown continued, because again, at that point, no formula, no tax plan, no budget, until finally on May 30th, the legislature passed a new school finance formula signed by the governor on June 15th. That formula, known as Senate Bill 19, was then sent to the Supreme Court for review. Lawmakers overrode the governor's veto of the tax plan, estimated to bring the state $1.2 billion over the next 2 years, which funded Senate Bill 19, which was good news. Senate Bill 19 provided for almost $300 million in new funding for schools across Kansas for fiscal year 18, but still the question of adequacy remains to this point in time. So that brings us kind of to the end of June. You could hear a collective sigh of relief across the state when the Supreme Court held that Senate Bill 19 could be put into effect July 1st, so that we had authority to expend funds. This was very good news to allow us to continue to do business, and the threat of shutdown, at least an immediate shutdown, came to an end. The state at that time made up most of one of the missed KPERS payments, so another positive sign. We're righting the ship. And then on June 29th, we presented to the board our understanding of a list of budget priorities for fiscal year 18. And the board looked at that. I think we added parents as teachers, but other than that, everyone was in consensus that these were the areas that we wanted to focus new money as we determined what new money would be for fiscal year 18, and we'll cover that here in just a second. As expected, and as we discussed in April, the district did end the year with some year-end cash. I believe we were forecasting at that point $7 to $8 million in year-end cash. We ended up slightly higher than that, between 8 and 9. And so we listened to what the board had said as far as its priorities, and we put those year-end funds in non-recurring areas, because we did not want to create an ongoing budget conflict that we've had before, where we used one-time money for ongoing budget expenses, and then we just end up having to kick the can down the road. We put it in non-recurring expenditures, such as textbooks. We did put some of the funding into textbooks because we knew the district was getting ready to look at reading for fiscal year 18. We put it into technology. We put it into professional development, especially knowing how that the district is really going to work on the social, emotional pieces in fiscal year 18. And we were able to put money into contingency reserve. And I want to talk a little bit about that. If we look at contingency reserve, and I've got a kind of a 5-year history on the presentation, we restored contingency reserve initially back to pre-block grant levels. So that was kind of our goal, is to try to get it back to where we were before the block grant kind of forced us to start utilizing some of those reserves in order to meet budgetary items. This $14 million would cover around 8 to 9 days, 8.25 days, if you want to be kind of specific. The $10 million was covering 5 to 6, so we've added a little bit back in. But the primary reason we put it in contingency is we knew that this was the area which gives the board the most flexibility to make some decisions ongoing. And we're proposing tonight that the board use some of the contingency to keep the mill levy fairly level. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. So again, just to kind of revisit the fiscal year 18 budget priority list, recruitment and retention through compensation, kind of the top on the list. And then the different programs, this aligns very well with Superintendent Thompson's vision for academic rigor, the social emotional pieces, all of those priorities that she's kind of given her team, marching orders to go out and conquer. We think that we're very aligned with that through this list. We listened to what the board had talked about during its superintendent search. So I think we had a good framework for putting together fiscal year 18 budget items. Okay, so we could spend weeks talking about individual line items in the budget. So we're really just going to give a high-level view tonight. Our net budget overall is $682.6 million for fiscal year 18 compared to the $662 million that we had last year. That's an increase from a budgetary standpoint of $20.6 million. I like that the scale is up as opposed to the other direction. So this slide makes me very happy. If we break down to begin with the state aid pieces, so I don't want to kind of park new money to the side for a minute. We're just talking about what the state is contributing to our budget. General state aid, including those new weighting pieces, particularly at risk, we're going to get $24 million in new general state aid. Special ed did not change as much as we had anticipated, primarily because of our, we can't hire enough special ed teachers. There's just not enough of them out there. So we have somewhat flat aid here. The local option state aid is actually down $1.7 million. And we'll talk a little bit more about this on a future slide, but essentially the formula actually takes last year's state aid and applies the LOB percentages. So it's not based on the $115 million of local option budget for fiscal year 18. It's based on the $111 million of local option budget in fiscal year 17. That coupled with kind of the changes in the state's assessed valuation model, we're going to lose 1.7 on LOB state aid, which would typically need to be made up in property taxes, but that's why we want to talk about that here in just a second. The other kind of important item to note is the CAPERS state aid. From a budget to budget perspective, our CAPERS is going to go up. But from what we actually paid in CAPERS, we only actually paid CAPERS, the pass-through item was only $27 million. So that budget is expected to go up to $43 million. So that accounts for some of those variances as if you're trying to track from budget back to actuals or budget to budget. It gets all sorts of confusing primarily because of CAPERS. A little bit in capital outlay state aid and a little bit in bond and interest and a few of the other funds for total state aid increases of $27.6 million. If we focus a little bit on just new New funds available for expenditures. So I'm going to kind of peel back the little bits of capital outlay and bond and interest that are somewhat restricted in their nature. If we just look at general fund, local option budget, again, general fund, $24.1 million of funds available for new programs, compensation issue, all of those types of things that we talked about. The local option budget in terms of taxes and cash carry forward, we have budget authority that will go up $3.8 million. The state aid piece goes down 1.7. So we are recommending that we put in $2 million of our contingency reserve for this year to shore that up and not pass along a mill levy increase to our taxpayer. That leaves our total funds available of $28.2 million, $28.3, kind of less, if you want to take that, less kind of the fixed costs we've already identified. We're looking at kind of a $20.1 million figure. But almost 28.3 of new funds available. Again, a reminder of kind of where those fixed costs lived. We've talked a lot about those. Again, I mentioned it before, the comparisons from budget to budget will be difficult. Remembering that fiscal year 17 was a block grant formula, and we are now back to a weightings formula. CAPERS will no longer pass through the general fund in fiscal year 18. It will go direct to CAPERS. There were only the 3 payments made in fiscal year 17. That's going to cause some oddities in looking at actuals versus budget. And we've done quite a bit of work on the at-risk fund as far as to align our expenditures in order to meet the new accountability standards within the at-risk fund. So you'll see, if you were looking at what we spent last year in at-risk, that was around $65 million, but you'll see budgeted this year in the 80s. And that's part of that alignment. There is some additional weightings, but we are aligning expenses. We're already focusing on at-risk kids and identifying those that we have been spending, but maybe wasn't in the right fund because it wasn't as critical. We are now getting that aligned so that we can report, and then we can match that to student performance as will be required under at-risk funding. The district is budgeting some of those year-end cash items that we talked about, and the indirect rate that was 0% for fiscal year 17 has increased to 1.33% for fiscal year 18. Okay, so we've made references several times already to the mill levy. Here is our proposed mill levy for fiscal year 18. General fund stays flat at 20 mills. The supplemental general goes from 16.8 to 17.5. Capital outlay stays at 8. Bond and interest comes down a little bit from 8.8 to 8.03. Little special liability, and that leaves our total levy flat for the year. If we had not used contingency reserve to kind of shore up the LOB, our mill levy would have probably gone up about 1.45, something like that. Again, as we stated, that LOB formula was impacted by the way that formula is actually written, in that state aid is based on last year's LOB. We really feel pretty strongly that there's a good rationale to use this $2 million in contingency, because we don't really know what next year's going to bring yet. I wish we were out of budget uncertainty, but until the Supreme Court makes its determination and we see what the remedy is, we're still somewhat in that same state of budget uncertainty. So utilizing the contingency reserve until that formula shores up and we can plan what needs to happen year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, we might actually get out and be able to plan as opposed to reacting year to year. That will be an exciting change. That we think that's money well spent. Just a quick comparison of the mill levy over the past 5 years. You can see we've been as high, at least in 13-14 we were at 57. We came down to 53 and change. We were back up. A lot of that was when the equity piece was back and forth. And then our intent is to try to stay flat for 17-18. Just to give you a quick comparison of what that looks like compared to area mill levies. and these aren't final in these school districts, well, some of them may be at this point, but you can see that we are still on the lower end compared to our surrounding districts. So I feel pretty good about where we're sitting on the mill levy. So at this point, administration recommends the board establish 6 p.m. August 28th, 2017 as the public hearing and budget adoption for the 2017-18 budget, and we stand for questions.
Joy?
Hi. Well, your first year has just been full of uncertainty. Maybe we should give you a standing ovation tonight. Right? I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to just jump back to. When we were looking at the mill levy breakdown, there was a mill levy for special liability of 0.125, and I just wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about what that is.
Sure. We've had this special liability kind of on and off in the budget over for the past few years. This is a service center mill levy for some environmental work that they do. So we've seen it at the 0.5, and it went down, and then we were able to get rid of it. So we have a few more expenses, I think, than we thought we were going to have. So we're going to put just a little bit back into that.
So this is related to the cleanup at the service center
Yes.
that we're required to do.
Yes,
But
we are required.
We were given that land by the government, and then we had to clean it up. Okay, that's what that is. All right, and then I was speaking with another board member earlier today. We were kind of talking about the idea of keeping the mill levy flat and using contingency reserve for that. And I think I would be in favor of that due to a couple of things. For one, the budget has been uncertain for lots of people in Kansas. Our entire community is now trying to figure out what their tax bill is going to be in the new year and make that up. And so sharing that burden with them as they've shared with us over the last several years seems appropriate right now. And two, just to not sort of, their income taxes have gone up, business taxes have gone up. Even though the levy is flat, if property evaluations rise, your property taxes go up a little bit. And so to not then hit them again with another property tax rate hike this year and say, let's see where we are next year, that seems like a wiser solution to me. So I would be in favor of that, and I'll cede for other board members.
Lynn?
Thank you, Susan. This was very good. We talked a little bit about the year-end cash, what we had. Typically, we don't end up with that much. What were the major reasons for that?
You know, if I were a betting person, I'd almost play the lottery Wednesday to think that we had 2 phenomenal years related to weather, and that we did not have snow days, and the climate was very mild, so our utility costs were low. Fuel costs, another second year of relatively low fuel rates. And then the transportation challenges that we've had through the school year, and then the challenge HR has in filling some of its key spots, special ed being one of those. But overall, there was some areas of unfilled positions that we ended up using subs. That's a budget savings. It's an unfortunate budget savings, but it's kind of the environment we find ourselves in, where education is not looked at perhaps as a field potential employees want to go into. We're hoping that we can turn that, and especially we have right now with new leadership, we have a lot of energy. I think we're, as Shannon mentioned, there's a lot of initiatives to improve employees' perception of how the district does business. So hopefully all of these things that are all occurring are going to really change perception related to Wichita Public Schools, and it's a very exciting time, and we're excited to be able to support that with a solid budget.
And I think we also talked to how we put the brakes on a lot of expenses as much as we did when we were having legislation talking about, 2% or 5% cuts across the board, with 30 days left of the school year, still in place.
Absolutely.
So, and then I guess that's the other thing I want to talk about on capers. You mentioned that, we're budgeting $43 million. But what control do we have over that $43 million, that dollar amount that's set? That's determined by the state capers board based on the contribution that needs to be made for the teachers that we have. Is that correct?
For all employees.
For all employees, yeah. And so, and then you said in 17 we did 27 million, and that's because they only paid 27 million.
Correct. We have actually zero control over that in and out for capers.
And so, and that's, I guess, what I want to point out is that we've had that problem for the last 2 or 3 years where they haven't funded capers in every case, but we have to add it into the budget. So people will say, well, your budget's 662, but you only spent 650. Well, if 12 million of the capers didn't come through, we have to budget the high end because if we budget lower and we get more, then we have to go back and republish and same with utilities and all those kind of things. So it's the difference. I think I've talked about that before here of budget versus actual. Those are always going to look different from beginning to the end. So some people always want to compare budget to actual, but you've got to understand, read the footnotes, I guess, is the issue. The LOB issue on equity, or the LOB of taking last year's, that was one of the issues, I guess, again, I also wanted to point out that I felt the formula was flawed from Topeka because, if we as a board today said we wanted to totally cut out the LOB, we would still get the state aid that is in this budget. Because it's based on last year's. It's not based on this year's LOB. And so to me, that's really an equity issue. And we tried to change that, but we weren't successful, in that regard. So I think again, and I think again, it's also important that we try to keep our mill levy stable. When I first joined the board, when we went back to 92 and before, I mean, there were years where the mill levy was 90 mills, and sometimes it would go up 10, down 20. And again, for our business community, I think it's very important to try to keep that as stable as we can for where we're at. So I guess those are the major issues that I have. I guess the other issue is I do like what I've been hearing and seeing on what we're putting in for at-risk and how we're looking at that. Do you want to talk about that a minute? Of how we're rebudgeting, because again, the legislature is going to be looking at us a lot closer of how we spend our at-risk dollars.
At-risk has not been a focus of under the formula for several years now. So we basically have, especially on the block grant, we approached it as whatever we spent last year in at-risk, that's what we're going to spend this year in at-risk. So and
they told us at that time they didn't care.
That was
exactly.
Perfectly acceptable. We didn't really have what I would consider to be a robust plan related to at-risk, and we certainly did not have an allocation method in place as far as what does it cost to educate an at-risk student. So to turn that is going to take us some time. There is an at-risk group that's working on not just what we're doing year one, but what we'll do year 2 and year 3 and go forward. But some of the early steps we've taken on at-risk include analyzing each school and what their student population is for at-risk children. And so then we took those core teachers and we split fund them to say, okay, if we're at this school and it's 70% at risk, then the teachers really are 70% at risk because that school is that percentage. The next school might be 80-20. The school down the street might be 60-40. We allocated those salaries based on a actual count per school to kind of set a platform as here's kind of a base, and from this point then we'll start to build. We looked at certain programs that we were already doing. I think we talked about, and I can't remember the name of it, but the one we presented, I think, at the last board meeting, where the funding might have been just out of 06 to say, no, that really makes more sense that we fund and record that in Fund 13. So we're capturing those expenditures accurately and we can match that with the data, the student achievement data, when legislative post audit comes in another year or two. and hopefully we continue to gain ground in that area and continue to push new programs into at-risk. That will be some constant rebalancing for us, but it's worth it to make sure that we are meeting the state's requirements on accountability, and even more so, that we're meeting the needs of our at-risk kids.
Okay, thank you.
Cheryl?
Yes, I just have a couple questions about the whole piece with capers, and it went through our budget last year, and it's not going to run through our budget, I mean, the general fund.
Right.
Talk about that just a little bit more so that we're clear on that.
What was happening in last year's budget is capers actually was counted in the general fund, and from the general fund we had to transfer to capers. So if you were looking at fiscal year 17 budget, you had an inflated general fund, and then you had more transfers down because money was coming out of the general fund and into capers. For fiscal year 18, you're going to see monies going direct to capers, so you don't have that general fund inflation. And where that's important is if you are trying to compare budget to budget or budget to actuals, and you're having a difficult time coming up with, well, how did this work? Understanding that a big chunk of it is capers.
And that's where we got caught in Topeka some, because people said your budget is this amount, and we said, no, it's really this, and it was all that capers piece. So that'll help clear that up.
It should. Again, it's been back and forth for so many years that if you're looking historically, it gets to be a little challenging, but if the formula stays stable for the next 5 years, then we should have a pretty good track record of how we will go forward.
Okay. And when I look at where you've kind of pulled down the new funds for fiscal year 18, the local option budget coming in at roughly 1.7 million less than we got last year. That's part of the reason why we're pulling that 2 million out.
Yes.
To make up that difference.
Yes.
And we're taking that out of our contingency, cutting the number of days we have in order to be able to do that.
Right.
But that allows us to hold our mill levy.
That's correct.
Okay. One more question, and that is on the mill levy slide. There's a 0.13 sitting there right at the top.
That's that slide just rounds it, but it's the 0.125 of special liability that Ms. Akins asked about.
Okay.
The service center.
So that's not something that's just out there. It's already in that
It's
special
new,
liability.
Yeah, it's new for fiscal year 18, but we absorbed it in other areas in the mill levy.
Okay. And I agree with Joy, and I think probably the rest of us, right now in our community with this kind of budget that we're still trying to figure out exactly where the money's coming from, and how much we're going to have, holding our mill levy at 0 is a really good thing for our community, and I think we're probably all happy with that. I had one more, but, it was on the budget priorities, because the money, the roughly 20 million that we have roughly left, this budget priority list is what we're going to be working from to build the actual budget, correct?
That we've built the actual budget based on this.
These priorities.
Yes. In
Okay.
fact, and I've had several conversations with Dr. Thompson that if we're adding new positions, it's got to vet through this list.
Okay.
And if it doesn't meet this list, then it's not that we don't want to do it, but it may not be first year priority. It may be a second or third year.
So when we see the budget 2 weeks from now, will we be able to see kind of how this fell out?
You will see increase in lines. It'll be kind of difficult to piecemeal certain things,
Right.
but generally you should see bumps in areas of the budget that you would expect to see bumps based on this priority list.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much to you and all of your staff, because I know you have spent hours and hours and hours trying to work under the timeline that they have.
Joy?
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought of a few more questions. One, I wanted to ask you, because now we're in a formula situation which is dependent on enrollment as opposed to a block grant that assumes same number of kids every year. So in this numbers that you're showing us, is that based on the coming year's enrollment and our projection about what that is, and how did that work?
The base aid per student, the new BASE aid per student, is based on last year's enrollment, or the second previous year, whichever is higher. So that was done in order to allow the legislature some knowledge of how much potentially it would hit the budget. So that was purposeful. But the weightings are based on estimates on current year.
Okay. So we have from last year or the year before is our base, and then all of the weighting is what we assume will happen this year. And so
Right.
that could change up or down, and the next board could need to do some work to fix that.
Right size possibly.
I think I had to do that the first year I was on the board. We had to have a budget hearing and kind of change that before the end of the year.
I mean,
Okay.
it's our best estimate of the facts that we know today. And yes, it could go up, could go down. KSD is very good about squaring us up through the audit process, so
Yes, they
we'll
are.
definitely find that out.
Okay, and then on the budget that was left over from the end of the year, it's always wise when you see, I mean, without allotments, it's wise to be careful with your money, make sure you don't overspend and all of that. And 8 million on a 600 and some million budget is a very small percent. One thing I think I heard you say is part of that was from some capital expenses that we chose not to start on now or last at the beginning of the year because we thought we might have cuts and we didn't want to have no money.
The funds left over, as far as what I would consider to be year-end cash, were primarily general fund and primarily general fund savings. The cash in capital outlay is higher than we anticipated. If you would look at last year's budget, I think, can't remember where we budgeted it, but it was low. It's significantly higher than that because of that pullback. The fear that we had was during the threat of either mid-year cuts or allotments, that we might have to move some general fund expenses that were allowed in capital outlay, which we hadn't had to move to capital outlay, which is, again, there's consequences to that. But in this case, to avoid having, some sort of layoff or detrimental impact to the classroom, we wanted to give ourselves that flexibility. Also, the concern that capital outlay had been running so tight that we were holding to make sure the state aid came in. Mm-hmm. So projects that we had planned didn't really get running and off the ground as quickly as we had anticipated because we were waiting for those funds to hit the capital outlay fund. So the good news there is that we are very well positioned as we go into fiscal year 18 to hit the ground running with projects. That's the good news. And it is our intent to bring back some specific information related to kind of our capital outlay plan because it is something we definitely need to have a really strong plan, not just for this year, but for the upcoming years because of the deferred maintenance and all of those things that as funding comes in and we don't have to resort to moving expenses to capital outlay, we definitely need to give some priority to those.
And that's what I was going to ask, is if we could at some point hear about that, because I think knowing when we have openings in classrooms and we know we're filling those with substitutes, we have a fine substitute pool, but that's not the same as an educator who's been trained to teach in the classroom and who's given their life to that. And so we can see that impact, but what I think sometimes we sort of struggle with, or I do as a board member, is what does it mean when we don't spend on capital outlay? Do we have classrooms with malfunctioning equipment? Do we have bathrooms that don't work? To what level is that, and how long can we defer that? Because we don't, as Mr. Rogers has reminded me a few times, we don't want to be where we were as a district before the 2000 bond, where boards had kind of kicked that can down the road too long. And so while it's nice to think, okay, well, we can just wait to paint again and again and again, at some point that begins to be a problem for our students. So that would be great to hear that. And then the last thing I just wanted to make mention of, because sometimes we don't draw this line very carefully, when we talk about the mill levy being low in Wichita compared to surrounding areas, it is lower. However, that doesn't mean that property taxes are lower, because in Wichita we have a higher concentration of commercial property, and what I didn't know before I got on this board is that commercial property is taxed at almost twice the rate of a residential property. So Mr. Rogers is correct when he says this really would help business owners not to, again, add, because I work with a lot of business owners in town. Their employees are wanting them to, increase their pay to cover the new tax. Some of them are getting taxed and additional taxing for their business, and then they also have property tax on top of that. And so to raise that would, again, cause more additional problems. So I think it's a wise decision by the board. I would move that the board establish 6 p.m. August 28th as the public hearing and budget adoption for this next year's budget.
Second.
Mr. Rogers?
No.
You're done? Okay. We have a motion by Joy and a second by Cheryl. Motion passes 7-0. Thank you very much again.